Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 6 game from the Chess Max Academy GM Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 5 video, you know that I lost a very quick and really lousy game against International Master Brandon Jacobson, and it was really just an uninspiring effort that got me to -2 without a win yet in the tournament. So I was really hoping to, change the tide a little bit, and what better way than to start with the white pieces. So I was paired with white in this one against Grandmaster Leonid Yudasin, and Yudasin is actually, been on the chess scene for many, many years. He's originally from Israel, but I think immigrated to the United States. And I've actually played him before many, many years ago. So I've seen him around for 10 plus years. And at one point he was actually, I believe, top 10 in the world. So this is not your average GM. He actually has really had his own place in the world's elite at some point. And even though he's a little bit up there age-wise now and is past his prime, he's still a very, very strong and dangerous player. So I was going to, I had to be alert as ever and, really just try and play a cleaner game than I did in round 5. So anyways, without further ado, let me get into it. So I'm with d4, typical for me, and Leonid played knight f6. And after c4, e6, this is basically like the first question is how to play. Would I play knight f3 or knight c3? And I noticed that Yudasin is typically a Nimzo player, so I thought, well, if I know exactly what line he's going to go for, I can kind of figure out the position that I'm going to get. And so I played the move knight c3 because I figured these types of lines, there were some ideas that I had that were kind of interesting, and not surprisingly, he went for bishop b4, so I got a Nimzo Indian, and it's always a great thing when you get essentially what you predict. And so I've actually kind of been a huge proponent of these days actually being, guessing, predicting well, and then if you predict well, you typically play reasonably, because if someone, it's almost like in poker or something, like or even in a sport, like if you know what what play they're going to run, you might as well go for that and try to prepare against that. And so, I feel like if you guess the opening correctly, you get a good shot at a good position and just a good game. So, anyways, after bishop b4, I played the move queen c2, and this was a move that in basically the latter half of 2019 started to really appeal to me, the queen c2 Nimzo. Part of the reason for that is, the bishop pair is an asset in chess. Bishops are better than knights. If you've been watching videos on this channel, you know that I have quite the affinity for the bishop pair. And the queen c2 Nimzo, you pretty much get it right away, because the idea is that you defend the knights that you don't have to recapture and give yourself double pawns, and your very next move is a3. So typically you're going to get the bishop relatively quickly. Now, Yudasin actually played d5 here, but that's actually not the move I was expecting. He did take a little bit of time here, so maybe he had figured that I was sitting on some ideas of his, or some of the lines he normally plays, but typically he plays the move c5, which is the Berlin variation of the Nimzo, of the queen c2 Nimzo. It's like a sub-variation within the variation. And this is actually one of the rare lines where white does not get the bishop pair in the classical Nimzo, because a3 here is actually a mistake, because if you play a3, they can take on c3, and after queen takes, take on d4, and then actually play knight c6. And this is one of those positions where the bishop pair doesn't justify the lack in development, because now black has two minor pieces already developed to white's nothing, and black's ready to castle, and white's going to need a lot more time to do that. So black can begin active operations in the center once the queen moves away, and so you can't actually go for this. But the positions after c5, d takes c5, tend to be quite decent for white. Part of the reason for that is the half-open d file gives white a lot of counterplay against the d pawn. And so in a lot of lines, white winds up going bishop g5, e3, and rook d1, and getting very nice pressure on that pawn. So that's pretty much basically the thing that happens on the Berlin line of the classical Nimzo. And I think Yudasin kind of figured, I'm not going to go for this, because he probably has some concept here, given that I play this line religiously. So anyways, after queen c2, d5 was played. And here I played the move a3. Now, there is another line with c takes d5, but one of the things I don't love about this one is it gives black multiple options, and I think both of them are good. So one of the options here that was actually used in a world championship match unsuccessfully between Anand and Kramnik is the move queen takes d5. And this is quite a unique situation where typically the queen actually winds up going to f5. Note that I can't, capture on d5 right away because I'm pinned anyway. But usually there's some lines with knight f3 and queen f5. And in these types of endgames, white actually, technically has a better pawn structure, but black has a really nice grip over the e4 square. So typically white players don't go for this. They normally go queen b3, decline the trade of queens. And I believe in the game between Anand and Kramnik from their world championship match, white played the move h3 and then g4 to hassle the queen on f5 and got a decent ending. But the point is there's a lot of flexibility here in black's structure, and the lines are less forcing. So it's more difficult to predict what happens next. The other thing about c takes d5 is black can also play e takes d5. And I also don't like this particular continuation because you're actually giving black this light squared bishop, basically a diagonal for nothing, and really freeing up black's game for this bishop and for an eventual rook to come to the half-open e-file after he castles. And so to me, it seems very, very questionable that you're going to get, good compensation for your lack in development here, and that's why I don't particularly fancy this line, although it's been played hundreds of times. So instead, I played the move a3, getting that bishop right away. And after bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, we have the bishop pair. So we know this is a long-term asset, and obviously white lacks development here, but if I'm able to kind of stem the tide development-wise and get all my pieces out, the two bishops will be a good trump. So typically here, the most popular move is actually castles. Yudasin actually played knight e4, and knight e4 is actually an extremely sharp continuation usually. It's a bit of a rare move. Typically the more popular moves are castles or d takes c4. Sometimes in conjunction. So sometimes the move order doesn't matter too much. One example I'll just show you is if castles, let's say knight f3, d takes c4, queen takes c4, and b6. And the idea that for black here is to play bishop a6 and hassle the queen and really the whole a6 to f1 diagonal. And white sometimes has a tricky time like completing the development cleanly and castling before black gets in some good counterplay, typically with a c5 break. There are many lines where black will play c5 even if it costs a pawn, because it means that the c file will be opened, and with the c and the d files open, black will have more activity because black's trumps in the position are really for the most part short term. Again, white has the two bishops, so white has the long-term trump. Black needs to play actively before white is able to consolidate, and this is one of the ways to do that. So it's a little bit safer, a little bit more reliable. Knight e4 is a very, very sharp continuation that tries to go for it right away. And you might say, well, why is this different than b6? Because you just said black's play is in the short term. Well, one of the reasons knight e4 is very bold is because it actually kind of breaks a rule. You're moving a piece multiple times in the opening, and that's something you normally shouldn't do. And the other thing is from e4, the knight is actually kind of vulnerable, right? On f6, it was a healthy distance away from the white pieces. But after knight e4 and then queen c2, which I played, you can see here that black can't play d takes e4 because the knight on e4 is hanging. And even though I can't play f3 just yet, because that would run into queen h4 check and some tactics with knight takes g3, there's a dynamic at play now where this knight could be tactically loose and prevent black from beginning super crazy operations in the center. So that's one of the things that makes this move a little bit risky, although it's a very sharp line and is usually played for very ambitious players. So I thought Leonid was really spoiling for a fight with that decision. After queen c2, black played the move knight c6. This is a normal after you play the line with knight e4. And here I played the move knight f3, which is, not the best move in my opinion in the position, but certainly playable. E3 is also very playable. In both of these moves, actually, with knight c6 and knight e4, black's typical play, believe it or not, is to play e5. And a lot of the times the concept is you play e5, you play bishop f5, and you try to, basically tactically rip open the center and play for discoveries against the queen and take advantage of, again, white's lack in development. So one kind of crazy line is if I do play a3, which I didn't, black can play e5, and then the most principled line here is actually f3, challenging this knight. And the idea is that after queen h4 check, you actually go g3, because after knight takes g3, there's queen f2. And note that black can't take on h1 because the queen h4 is hanging, so knight f5 is obligatory. And you have this really, really wild position that seems to be a total mess. And now that, and also not to mention the fact that so many things are hanging. But after c takes d5, knight a5, and d takes e5, white is actually temporarily a pawn up. But you can see the position is so irregular that it's really anyone's game, and I think pretty much whoever knows more about the position is probably going to fare pretty well. So this was the type of madness I did not want to get involved in, but it's very possible, and there are games in the position with, and there's the games in the database from this position, so something to think about. So I played the move knight f3 instead of e3, which is a bit of a more controlled approach, trying to restrain e5 a little bit. Black here played the move a5, and this move is actually a little bit puzzling and frankly not entirely correct. Now, I understand the idea behind it. It's to kind of restrain the b4 move, but actually, you actually don't really achieve very much with a5 besides restraining b4, and white's really just going to try and develop and try to get some consolidation in the position, and a5 doesn't try to disturb white's consolidation. So that's why it's not particularly challenging. Believe it or not, instead of a5, I believe e5 is a move even in this position with the idea of bishop f5. And so knight f3 doesn't actually stop bishop f5. It just kind of contains it. There's a line with c takes d5 now, queen takes d5, and e3. But again, as you can see, black's going to have some play here, and has some active opportunities. Queen a5 check and bishop f5 to kind of hassle white. So a5 doesn't really challenge white's center and justify the position of the knights on e4 and c6, which are extremely irregular. I explained why the knight on e4 is irregular. There's a well-known thing, that people talk about in queen's pawn openings, where typically you shouldn't put the knight in front of the c pawn in queen's pawn openings, because it disrupts your opportunity to contest in the center. And you can see here that with these knights kind of being just strangely placed, I wouldn't say misplaced, but strangely placed, it's not going to be good long term. So anyways, after a5, I just went e3, continuing my development. And now e5 tactically is not justified because my bishop is actually ready to come out to d3. So in the previous lines, e5 sometimes is justified because I'm not in time to play e3 because of knight g3. But now in the position, because of a5, now e5, if it takes bishop f5, I can just take on I can actually just play bishop d3, and I don't need to take on d5 and activate the queen. I can just play bishop d3. There's no discoveries anymore because my queen is secure and the diagonal is secure. So basically, after e3, black castled, and I played bishop d3 now, but I think that white is actually pretty comfortably better because I have the two bishops, I have nice pressure in the center, and no serious problems to speak of. Now, because of these positional trumps and the long-term, potential of my position, Yudasin has to continue to justify his position of his knight on e4, because if he goes back, he's kind of admitting his mistake. And so after knight e4, Yudasin played the move f5, and it's really the only try to, justify the knight here. Now, the issue with f5, though, is it just weakens more squares in the position, particularly the e5 and g5 squares. And now the e6 pawn is also backward. And so it's kind of like a Dutch stonewall position without the dark squared bishop on d6. And, in the stonewall, the dark squared bishop is the most powerful piece in the stonewall. So it's really, really tough to justify this whole setup. And that's why I think white is actually pretty much better. Now, after f5, I played the move b3, kind of waiting to see how black was going to set up, because I thought that it'd be a useful move to put my bishop on b2 and put it on this long diagonal. Now, you might say it's behind the wall of pawns on b2, but actually I get closer to connecting my rooks, and there is potential for the position to open up at some point, and then the bishop on b2 would be quite effective. So b3 I thought was a good move. But there was also nothing wrong with castling. And I think I just kind of wanted to wait and not castle kingside, because I wasn't sure if he was going to go rook f6 and rook h6, and I was kind of wary of these direct attacks. So I just waited with b3. After b3, black played the move bishop d7, just trying to get closer to connecting the rooks. Maybe this bishop will, shift over to a new diagonal later. And now I played bishop b2, just developing. And here bishop e8 was played. And this was another reason why I was kind of hesitant to castle kingside, because I thought that maybe this bishop would challenge this knight on f3 and start to harass it, and I wasn't sure about certain structures with g takes f3 if I want to entertain that, and I didn't see any way to kick the bishop away. And one of the annoying things I thought is that when this bishop does get to h5, if I do wind up moving the knight from f3, I didn't like that the bishop would be eyeing the d1 square, making it, difficult for my rook to land on d1. So really I was kind of wary of this maneuver, and it was because of this that I actually decided to spice things up when it wasn't really necessary to do that. Now, the move that I played was extremely aggressive, because I played the move h4, trying to kind of deter black from entertaining any attacking possibilities on the king side. But instead, just again, the simple castles would have been very good. And one interesting idea is that after bishop h5, I can actually just go knight e1. And the point is that I'm actually just going to play f3, kick this knight on e4 away, and restrict the bishop on the h5 to d1 diagonal. And white is just comfortably better because black doesn't really have any effective pawn breaks. Of course, if you push e5 somehow, you're just opening up diagonals for the bishops. And the same goes for f4. So as long as black doesn't have any real pawn breaks, and I kick black's pieces away, white's going to have a safe position. And one of the important details is that if queen g5 trying to deter me from playing f3, I could play f4, but that wouldn't be so nice in my opinion, because the bishop all of a sudden has scope. Instead, a better move is actually just queen c1. And the point is you cover the e3 pawn, and so you can play f3 next and get that desired push to kick the knight away. And white is just safely better. So this would have been a much better course of action than h4, even though h4 is very, very interesting and enterprising. So after h4, black unsurprisingly played bishop h5, getting this bishop to this diagonal where really it can't be kicked away anymore, because there's no way I'm going to play g4 right now. And h4 pretty much also signaled that I'm not going to castle kingside, because I'm pushing pawns in front of my king, which kind of makes it a little bit less safe to castle kingside. And so really my idea with h4 is just to take space on that flank and then potentially castle queenside. And one of the things I liked about h4 is I thought that in the right circumstance I could entertain knight g5, and even at the cost of a pawn, open up the h-file for an attack. So I thought that in some circumstance, if white played the queen to d7, for instance, I might go knight g5 and then play like f3, and then really start to get some initiative going on the king side, where black's king might feel a little bit unsafe. So after bishop h5, I actually just castled, and it was like, yeah, bring it on, take on f3. I'm actually totally fine if you do that, because if you take on f3, I play g takes f3, the knight on f3 on e4 has to go away, and then my rook on d1 comes to g1, and I have like a ready-made attack against the black king. So I thought after castles that, I really was trying to get the absolute maximum. And you can argue that this wasn't super necessary. I had a safe advantage if I just castled kingside and played positionally. But I thought my position was so good that I decided to get a little bit more ambitious than just playing for a stable, static advantage. And that's pretty much was my decision with h4 and castles queenside. Black now played the move a4, and this is actually a very interesting move, trying to kind of break open my pawns on the queen side, but it doesn't really change the story very much, because after the move I played b4, there's no attack here right now because the A and B files are kind of shut down, and I'm able to kind of just close up the lines, and so I felt pretty good after the inclusion of A4 and B4, and yeah, I thought I didn't really have many problems. Now, the one thing that A4 did do, which, you know, is kind of clever for black, is it did weaken my light squares just a touch, because by pushing the move B4, C4 was a little bit less secure, and the B3 square might be a little bit sensitive, and black might have an idea at some point of trying to, you know, take advantage of some of these light squares with a knight or another piece. So, actually, keep in mind that I said that, because yeah, it actually did come into play at some point. But for the moment, because I have all this massive space advantage, it doesn't really present itself as a problem at all. Note that also, like, you know, sacrifice with knight takes b4 and a takes b4 and a3 don't really go anywhere. I can just put the bishop on a1, and this pawn can reach a2, but it's not really doing very much. So piece sacrifices to push the pawn don't really, you know, get anywhere. So, anyways, after b4, Yudasin played knight e7, and yeah, this is actually kind of logical. Now that this knight on c6 did not have any path forward in the position, black aims to kind of course correct by rerouting this knight somewhere else and potentially playing on the light squares, potentially on the d5 square. So in some lines now, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight d5 actually makes a lot of sense, essentially trying to blockade the bishop on b2 out of the game. So I actually played the move c5, trying to not give this knight the d5 square, because I thought it would be, you know, a bit of an annoying outpost to contend with, because that was basically, I thought, the idea. But actually, c5 is not the best move in the position, and c5 actually does kind of break an important rule, or not rule, but just principle about keeping tension in the position. So it really was kind of not necessary for me to release the tension. Instead, the computer gives a massive edge to white after the move rook dg1. And I can see why this move is attractive, because now my knight on f3 is free to actually go to e5 because there's no pin anymore connected to the rook being on d1. And if I'm able to somehow rip open with g4 and play something like f3, these bishops will start to play, and it'll be massive trouble for black. Now again, one of the things I was mildly concerned about was d takes e4 and knight d5. But frankly here, you know, after knight d5, the pawn on e6 behind it is extremely weak, and it's quite unlikely that white would be able to hold this together for too long, this blockade. So I can actually probably go knight e5, and then eventually just play f3 by, you know, preparing it by defending the e3 pawn. So probably this position is just a beauty and one that I should have gone for. Another thing is the knight on e4 is also, you know, a bit unstable because of the move g4, and that move, you know, also might pry open the g file because f takes g4 obviously hangs the knight. So really, my concern about this blockade on the light squares was probably not totally warranted, and yeah, I just had a little bit of a lapse in judgment there because, yeah, c5 actually did shut down an important avenue for counterplay on a certain diagonal. So, anyways, after c5, black played the move f4, and f4 also is kind of a reason why c5 is not ideal, because if I played rook dg1, f4 would have been totally out of the question. For starters, it would just hang a pawn on e4, but it would also give me wonderful coverage to actually rip open the position with d5. So something like this would just not be at all playable for black, because black does not have the d5 square to work with. But f4, as was played in the game, was actually extremely alert by Yudasin, because basically what he's saying is, look, you can win a pawn if you like, but I'm going to have the light square on d5 for either my knight or my queen, and as soon as I occupy that square, you're going to have a really hard time activating your bishop on b2. And that blockade, coupled with my counterplay on the f-file, will justify the loss of a pawn. And that judgment is actually correct. And so I really shouldn't have allowed this opportunity, and that's another reason why I shouldn't have played c5. So after f4, I really had, a decision to make, and I really did still feel I was better. I mean, it seemed a little bit weird that black was actually opening up the king side where, I was actually trying to attack. So I didn't feel like I was, in a dire situation here, but it was just something that kind of disturbed the logical flow of the game, which was me kind of, taking the space and pushing him back. All of a sudden, Yudasin is the one that's, trying to take some space. So after f4, I played the move bishop takes e4, but this is not a move I took very lightly, because it seems on the face of it like a extremely risky decision. I'm giving up one of my bishops, so I don't have the bishop pair anymore, and I'm giving up the d5 square, but I had a very concrete idea in mind. Now, another move in the position that was suggested by the computer is actually rook d e1. And this is actually a move I can see why it's recommended and makes sense. The idea is that by putting more pressure on the e4 knight before taking it, you're able to get more pieces to active squares before black's able to take advantage of the d5 square. So here, I have a rook now lined up against e4 as well, which means that the e6 pawn might be hanging after I take on e4, and that would mean that the d5 square would not fully justify being down multiple pawns. And so after rook d1, the computer says f takes e4 is obligatory. But now after rook takes e4, the knight isn't getting the d5 square for now, and I'm just generating more play on the e-file than black seems to be getting on the f-file. So this position would probably be just much better for white. Instead, after bishop takes e4, d takes e4, the idea I had in mind and which I played was knight g5. And I must say, I thought that my position was just nearly winning here. I mean, not winning, but I thought it was significantly better, because I thought this was just going to be a massive advantage for white. Now, there are some threats here. First of all, there's knight takes e6, which would seem to fork the queen and rook on d8 and f8 respectively. But the really big idea actually is that if bishop takes d1, I'm not going to take on d1 with my queen. I'm instead going to play queen takes e4. And the dual threat of queen takes h7 mate and queen takes e6 check means that white will actually be up at least 2 pawns with a dominant position, because you have to defend the mate threat first. And there's really no clean way to do that. Of course, let's say you block with the knight, like knight g6. Now again, queen takes h5, queen takes e6 check is strong, and after king h8, I take on d1, and I'm 2 pawns for the good. I'm threatening knight f7 check, and my bishop is going to be opened up with the very next move with d5. And so being down the exchange here doesn't really matter very much, or so I thought. So I just thought this position was extremely promising, and this was basically the idea. But after knight g5, Yudasin thought for some time and then played the move queen d5, which is by far the best move in the position, and I think shows really good dynamic judgment. He accurately judged that it was very important to defend these pawns and to retain the light square control, and that the exchange right now really did not matter that much. Now, after queen d5, I have another decision to make, because again, everything seems to be defended, or at least the mate is defended, and d1 is hanging. But I figured that if I move the rook, white pretty much is going to get, kind of not the position that they want, and black's going to establish the dark square blockade. So let's say I go rook d1. I thought black could take, and then, essentially play something like, I don't know, maybe like rook f5. And all of a sudden, I actually would probably prefer black. Actually, Actually, it's tough to say, but basically, I think black is very, very active here. This bishop is very active on this diagonal. This rook has the open f-file to work with. This knight is going to be quick to replace the queen on d5 if need be, and it just seems like black is very active here, and this is not what was the desired position. So instead, I played the move that I had looked at after queen d5, and it was the move f3. And I must say here, I did feel I was very, very close to getting a decisive position because it seemed now that the threats were kind of overwhelming. Now, the first threat is just f takes e4, but note that black can't take the pawn on f3 and deal with that because I have queen h7 mate. So the pawn on e4 is effectively pinned. And I thought that if f takes e3 is played, I would play f takes e4 anyway and just get a massive, massive positional edge based upon my pawn roller going forward in the center. And so I thought I was doing very, very well here, and that the center was just about to collapse, which would also activate my bishop on b2. But Yudasin here played a very, very good move, very keen and alert move, which was h6. And h6 I just did not fully appreciate as a move that would be very good, but it turns out to be very, very effective because essentially my knight here was very, very annoying, eyeing the e6 and e4 pawns, but now that my knight is challenged, I actually don't get to recapture f takes e4 with I don't get to recapture the pawn e4 with my pawn. I actually have to recapture with the knight, and that kind of changes the circumstances just a little bit. So I played knight takes e4, but this is not what I wanted to do. I wanted to play f takes e4. And note that here, if I play f takes e4, there's bishop d1, and yeah, it's just not ideal because after bishop d1, if I go queen d1, there's queen c4 check, just losing on the spot because now black would actually be up a rook after h takes g5. And if I go rook takes d1, well, the knight is still hanging, so the queen can move, let's say, to b3, and then after the knight moves, there's queen takes c2 check, and f takes e3, and, black is just way too active, and so my position just collapses. And so I pretty much have to play knight takes e4. And after knight takes e4, I thought, even here, I'm in great shape because I'm going to go knight c3 and break this blockade the queen has, but and I thought that if f takes e3, I might even have g4 as an option, or rook de1 and just recapture e3. But here Yudasin played knight f5, and knight f5 is actually a very good move, which really just prevents me from getting all of the dynamic play that I was seeking out, or just the safe plus I was seeking out. So after knight f5, the problem is now that there's this fork on e3, which is very annoying to deal with. And remember I said that this b3 square was a little bit sensitive after the a4 move earlier. Now the queen is actually on this diagonal. These squares are, things I have to defend and contend with. And they're actually the squares that make this queen not trapped, or at least give it play. Because, again, if I challenge it, the queen gets to move away. And so after knight f5, I actually played knight f3, challenging this queen. But now the queen just crept in with c4, and that's a huge, huge move because if the queen had to go back, let's say queen d7, now I play e4 without even thinking about giving up the exchange. And after, let's say, knight e3, queen e2, knight takes d1, and rook takes d1, white just has a massive edge because I'm going to play d5. The f4 and e6 pawns are split, which actually help my cause a little bit in terms of playing for the initiative. And even the a4 pawn is a little bit weak. So this is a type of position where this bishop really lacks entry any diagonals to really cause problems to white's position. And white can just slowly prepare for the d5 break with a decisive advantage. In fact, white might also consider trying to reroute the knight to e5 by going like knight b1, knight d2, knight c4, knight e5, and just that knight on e5 would be a permanent wedge that would be basically impossible to dislodge, and I think black would just be squeezed here. But because the queen comes to c4, playing for e4 is just not at all simple because after e4 there's not only knight e3, but there's also knight takes d4, which is knight takes d4. Yeah, it's also kind of annoying. So anyways, I did wind up playing e4, and here Yudasin played the move knight e3, which is actually, much better than knight takes d4, because if knight takes d4, white might consider the exchange sacrifice rook d4, and after knight d5, the queen remarkably is actually trapped. There's no squares it could go to that aren't covered by a white piece, so knight e3 is the more precise move. But I actually had some choices here before playing e4, and I just wanted to also point out that the other move I was considering, and the computer actually suggests is probably the best choice, is actually e takes f4. And the point is here, you give up the exchange. You're giving up the exchange as well, but you're also ruining your pawn structure. And so after knight e3, queen e2, queen takes, knight takes. Knight takes g2 is the move the computer suggests, because if you play knight takes d1 after rook takes d1, this is actually a much, much better version of the position that I kind of got in the game. And basically the point is here a few things. One, the queens are off the board, so my king is relatively secure here. And two, white actually has 2 pawns for the exchange, which means the material is actually equal, and that actually makes a huge difference when you consider things, because basically it makes it very, very difficult for black to gin up any counterplay, because I have all my pawns, and I basically, because I have every pawn in the position, the black rooks don't really have great files to operate on. Note that d4 is really well protected. And and the e6 pawn's actually super weak, and I might consider a move like rook e1 and g4, and then start to press the e6 pawn. So this is the type of position where white would be comfortably better, and because of that, black would need to play knight takes g2 and try and not get the exchange, get some of these pawns back, and get some counterplay. But what I kind of missed in this line, and this is not the end of it kind of makes sense that I missed this, is that this move d5 opens up the bishop and really breathes total life into the position. And the point is that all of a sudden white starts an attack out of nowhere based upon rook g1 or rook d7, and white actually is the one that has the edge here. So essentially, I basically missed a few things. First of all, I missed the fact that this queen trade would be very attractive for me, and I missed the fact that it didn't matter that my pawn structure was getting spoiled on the king side if it meant that I got to open up my bishop with this sacrifice. Because if I don't have this d5 move, black is actually the one that's quite active, because this bishop is better than mine on b2 presently, and so is the knight on g2. It's better than my knight on e2 because it's roaming free and harassing me. So that detail, d5, is the move I missed, and pretty much why I didn't go for this. So instead I went e4, and after knight e3, I went queen d2. Now, the computer actually suggests the move queen d3 is more effective. And again, I saw that the queen trade here would actually be good for me, because after knight takes g2, I'm actually preserving my f3 pawn, so it doesn't seem like there's any major problem here. But the reason that I didn't go for this is actually because I was worried about queen b3. And I thought here that, this knight on e3 is really not a piece that I want to contend with, and it just seems very annoying. But actually, after queen b3, I have the not obvious move, not rook d2. Rook d2 is a move, but I have the also very not obvious move, knight b5. And the point here is that I'm actually defending the mate and also trying to trade the queens again. And after knight takes d1, queen takes d3, intermediate move, a takes b3, and rook takes d1, I actually have a better version of what winds up happening in the game, because this b3 pawn is actually just a target that I can go and capture. And my knight on b5 is actually very, very active and forces one of the rooks to kind of defend the c pawn in a somewhat uncomfortable way, because if you go c6, my knight lands on d6 and becomes a monster knight, which prevents black's rooks from really activating. So this was actually another key idea. By the way, maybe knight c7 is also even better, because I can take on e6 and play d5. But you get the point that there are some real opportunities here for white with the move knight b5. But I just did not want to tolerate the queen here for too long, and I kind of missed this knight b5 idea. So instead, after knight e3, I went queen d2, giving up the exchange like that. But the problem here is that after knight takes d1, rook takes d1, this queen on c4 is actually remarkably active. And quite frankly, I thought it was better here. I thought that even though I had a pawn for the exchange, my pawn center and space advantage on the queen side would justify that pawn deficit. But it turns out this position is already about equal, and frankly kind of difficult for the white player to play, because black actually has a lot of tactical resources based upon the fact that my king is actually kind of unsafe on the light squares. And so I think this is actually one of the instances where I actually seriously misevaluated a position as opposed to missing, a few moves. I actually just misevaluated what the position was, because I truly did think this was like +1 for white. And then when I got here, I realized it was not so clear. I thought my plan was just to play king b1, d5, open the bishop up, and give checkmate. I thought there was no way, black could play ball with the bishop. Dark square bishop gets opened up, because this bishop on h5 is just out of the game right now. It doesn't really seem to have many diagonals to work with. My pawns are set up really wonderfully, blocking out the bishop. And so to me, it felt like I had two minor pieces for a rook, and that the bishop was just a fat pawn. But it just wasn't the case. After rook d1, black played the move b6, and I think this is the first move where I realized, this is just not clear at all, because basically what this does is it gives black's rook, it gives one of black's rooks an open file, and essentially the status quo of the position, the static space advantage that I thought would be kind of pleasant and where I'd be able to control the game and control the breaks, actually changes, because I can't play c6 because black would just take the pawn, and whichever pawn I recapture with, I open that file. So the question now is, do I want to open the B file by capturing the B pawn? Do I want to open the D file by capturing the D pawn? Or do I want to open with the C file by capturing with the C pawn? And so, toughest choice to make. I decided to play C takes B6, but this is actually already another mistake. Instead, I shouldn't have captured with either pawn, and I think that's another important moment where, keeping the tension is important, because we spoke about that earlier with my move to play C5 and release the tension between the pawns on D5 and C4 earlier in the game. Here's actually no different. I actually should play king B1 and allow black to take, because at least that opens up my bishop on the long diagonal. Now, the reason I rejected this with king B1 is because I thought that the game would just be kind of drawish after that, and it turns out that assessment was right, but I should have been comfortable with a drawish position at this point, given the fact that I'm not better. The line would go B takes C5 and D takes C5. Obviously, DC is a little bit better than BC, especially because my king is on B1. And here I didn't want to go for this because of rook D8, trying to just trade pieces. And I saw that I could play queen takes and rook takes, and was like, I don't want to go for this, because black probably has a perpetual with queen f1 and queen c4 whenever he wants on the light squares. But this is actually the best continuation that I can ask for. And after king h7, rook d7, it's not even a trivial draw. I thought it'd be easy because I could take on c7 and push my queenside pawns. But black is actually very fast with his own f-pawn, and so I have to be worried about queen f1, taking g2 and f3, and then pushing this pawn. And it's really by the skin of my teeth that I draw. So I'll show you here, after queen f1, king a2, queen g2, b5 actually has to be played. And then after bishop takes f3, b6. And I really have to be fast because this f-pawn becomes a factor. And after c takes, cb, queen c2, b7, queen b3, king a1, e5. Here, I have to play knight takes a4 and basically distract the queen from the b file just so I can queen. And okay, the line ultimately ends in a draw, but it's really not a trivial draw at all. And even in the final position, it's extremely unclear because black has, two passers that, could be a factor. And I have no checks. So even in the final position, it's not so easy to play. But that was basically, white's path towards equality. And, it would have been much better to, go for this than what I did with c takes b6. After c takes b6, a takes b6, my bishop on b2 is still stuck behind my d pawn. And that's a problem because it means that I'm really not playing. I'm playing down a piece, actually, in some ways. And I'm already down in exchange. So, that's not ideal. So I went king b1 now, stepping out of the way of the pin on the c file. And black played queen b3. And this is actually a really, really excellent move. Because what it does is it not only pins the bishop, but it also encroaches further on the light squares and keeps an eye on the d1 rook, which makes it difficult for my queen to roam. I played the move d5 now, trying to open things up because I thought it's now or never to open up my bishop on the diagonal. And on a really good day, I'd love the move e takes d5, knight takes d5, and then queen d4. Because again, if I can get this type of battery, I'm really hitting home on black's king. But the problem is after d5, black can just play the move rook a c8 and ignore this pawn tension right now because rook takes c3 is actually a massive threat. Note that if I just go d takes e6, after rook takes e3, I can't take with the bishop because the pin. And if queen takes e3, I am threatening mate, but there's queen d1 check first. And so here, I either have to trade queens after queen b3 check, and then I'm just down a rook, or white has to block and get one of the pieces off the battery, and I'm still down a rook. So basically, this rook c8 move just gives black the time to just build up more pressure here and deter me from ever getting my plans off the ground. And this is the difference between me being better potentially and me being worse. And so here I'm already in quite a bit of trouble because I just did not get my plan. My plan just never took off. Instead here after queen b3, instead of playing d5, I should have gone for queen c2, trying to bail out into an endgame where my structure is still intact at least. But even here, black has an excellent position because black's bishop on h5 is actually kind of resilient. At some point, it can reroute itself to one of these light squares, and it's actually just a really resilient piece because if I try to actually open the center with d5, this bishop will get a diagonal to work with, and so black will try to pile up on the c file and keep me restrained, and it'll be hard to not give black squares if I try to open up the position. The other thing that it seems like was kind of insignificant earlier, but now becomes more and more of a factor is this a4 pawn, because it really, cripples me on the light squares and, is, close to queening. So it's something that I have to worry about and, keep under observation. And it actually would become the bane of my existence. So anyways, after d5 and rook a c8, I realized now that the position was kind of critical and that I had really, not done well because this just is not very good. And I played the move knight e2 now, trying to essentially just deal with the rook takes c3 threat and also entertain knight takes f4 or knight d4. Now, it turns out here that there were a few better tries, one better try. The move that the computer suggests actually rook g1, which, actually makes a lot of sense when you look at it, and I'm kind of disappointed I didn't see this one. The idea is in some lines now, my rook is lined up against the g file, so I can sometimes entertain playing g3 and taking on f4 and getting counterplay that way, and I just prevent queen takes d1. So essentially now rook takes e3 is not a problem anymore, and I can maybe get back to trying my battery. After rook g1, black could play rook c4, though, preventing my queen from getting to the d4 square and preparing to double rooks, and this position is still very dangerous. I could go d6, though, getting a kind of dangerous pawn, and after rook c8, d7, rook d8, and queen d6, I'm actually kind of active because if you play rook takes e3, I have the move queen e7, And tactically here, I'm, obviously throwing the rook on d8. But if the rook on c2 moves, I actually have queen takes g7 mate. So a total mess of a position. And after queen c2, king a1, and rook takes d7, queen takes d7, and queen d3, we arrive at a position that's extremely, extremely complicated and would most likely probably fizzle out to a draw. But, finding all those moves for black and white would have been quite complicated and tricky, and, just a difficult one. Instead, though, I played the move knight e2, and this ultimately was not very good. Black now just took on d5, and I think this move is actually really, really well timed, because now that my knight has left the c3 square, I can't recapture on d5, which would ensure that the bishop doesn't have a great diagonal to operate on. Now, all of a sudden, this bishop on h5 is going to get one of these awesome diagonals, and it's really difficult to deal with. Note one other thing is I'd love to play the move knight takes f4 and hit the bishop with tempo, but here rook takes f4 collects a piece, because after queen f4, queen d1 again illustrates how powerful that queen was on b3 eyeing the d1 rook. So after e takes d5, I played queen takes d5 check, trying to keep the diagonal closed, and after bishop f7, the story still doesn't change. The black bishop is getting a diagonal. My bishop is open now as well, but black's rooks are way too active, and frankly, part of my compensation for being down the exchange was having this positional control in the center and the limitation of black's rooks. They didn't have files, but now that they have files, they're just proving to be way more effective than my minor pieces, and that's why I don't have the compensation for the exchange here. And so, it's already very tough. After bishop f7, I have to trade queens, because queen a2 mate was a threat. If I move the queen away, there was a checkmate there. So I have to take on b3, and after bishop takes b3, black is just dominating, because this rook is coming to c2 if it wants. The bishop is challenging the rook on d1. And amazingly, one of the things I noticed here is I would love to play rook d7 and get some pressure along the g7 pawn. But what I noticed when I got to this position was that if I played rook d7, it would seem that rook f7 would be fine for white, because I could take on f7 potentially, and then take on f4. And even though this position isn't totally rosy, at least I have two pawns for the exchange, and maybe I can hassle these pawns, and maybe I have some compensation here. But the key thing here is that if I play rook d7, black can actually just go rook d8. And remarkably, after rook takes g7 check, black can go king f8, and that was just one check. And now rook d1 is nearly a mating threat, because it just paralyzes all of my pieces. My king has back rank problems and really has no squares to go to, and playing a move like knight c1 would just lose the game. And so already here, this would just be like just another losing position, and you can kind of see how I can't even get active because black's rooks are just already on the C and D files. So after bishop b3, I played the move rook d2, which was way more passive, if you will, and kind of steady, trying to cover the rook to c2 and to deal with the counterplay on the c file, or on the second rank rather. But now black played rook d8 anyway, and I'm kind of obliged to trade, because if I play a move like bishop d4, knight d4, I'm just pinning myself with no possibility of unpinning myself. So after rook d8, I took on d8, and after rook takes, I played knight takes f4. And we have this endgame where I actually have recovered a second pawn, but the problem here is that my king is just in the doghouse. It's basically not free to come out, and that changes everything, because if my king was maybe on like e3 or e2, we might have a different conversation about who's better and why. But because my king is so passive, and this bishop and rook are kind of ensnaring my king, it really, really makes it impossible to really do very much. And believe it or not, even though the material is technically equal and I have two pawns for the exchange, I'm actually completely losing. It might be difficult to actually fully understand that without, precise, with some of these moves, because basically what Yudasin does from here is he plays a perfect game. His technique here was just truly, truly pristine, and I think it's extremely instructive to kind of show how to win this game, because again, I don't think it'd be easy for most people, but once you see it, you start to understand just how overwhelming this position is. And so why don't you pause the video here and actually find the next few moves, because if you can figure out the sequence that Black uses to win this game, you are certainly well on your way. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out the sequence that Yudasin played. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what Yudasin did here. So he started with the move G5. And this is a big, big time move, because you might say, well, why am I trying to trade pawns on this side? Doesn't white just have this massive pawn structure? Well, it appears that way, but look what happens. So after G5, H takes G5, H takes G5. Now my knight has to make a decision. Obviously, I can't go to D3 because I hang it. I go to D5, Black will just take it and get one of the pawns back. And so really, and if I play a move like Knight H5, I'm not particularly stable, because then Rook D2 comes on the board and attacks the G pawn. And so even though there's just one pawn here, it's a very, very annoying because it ruins, it challenges my setup a little bit. So I went Knight H3, trying to attack the G5 pawn and get some counterplay. And, maybe if you haven't, I think some people might just go Rook D2 and give up the G5 pawn and then go Rook takes G4 and say, okay, that's pretty good for white. I mean, that's pretty good for black. The knight is not very stable. This position, still is pretty decent. But the move that Yudasin played is so much stronger, and it's actually the move G4. And I think this move is kind of the crowning achievement of the last few moves that he made, because in one fell swoop, he ruins my entire setup. And the beautiful thing about this move is that if I try to move the knight away, let's say I play like Knight F4 and, trying to move the knight away, Black can actually keep the tension and just wait, or he can actually even play the move G3. And all of a sudden, this pawn might be a dangerous queening pawn, but he doesn't even have to do that. He can actually just, take on F3 and play Rook F8. He can play Rook D2. Essentially, this pawn structure that looks so beautiful now is actually going to be ripped to shreds. And so G4 is a really, really nice move that just does that. I took on G4 because I recognized that my pawn structure was going to be spoiled regardless. And my hope was that while white tried to recapture these pawns, I could generate some counterplay against black's queenside pawns. Because if the position was just bishop and knight and maybe one pawn versus rook and bishop, I think I'd be able to hold that. But unfortunately, I'm not able to get close to getting any of the queenside pawns because this a4 pawn is so difficult to attack and is cemented by the b3 bishop. And the b6 pawn is also quite tricky to attack once it gets to b5 because, again, both these pawns will be on light squares and my darker bishop obviously can't contest. And again, the major issue here is my king is just in the doghouse. Note that a move like king c1 just runs into rook d1. Oops, that's a bad arrow. Rook d1 mate. And my king runs it to c1. Rook d1 mate is a move. And so my king is really stuck very passive. And so the truth is black doesn't even have to, worry about defending the queenside pawns because they're not targets. And he can really just focus on corralling my own pawns. So it's just completely lost. So after rook d2 was played, I played knight f4 trying to defend my g2 pawn. And now rook f2, just an excellent move, just attacking the knight on f4. And I went knight d5. And my hope was here that, I'd again be able to challenge the queenside pawns. And while black actually, tried to take my kingside pawns. And I also was hoping that after bishop takes d5, e takes d5, my king might get active while black tries to secure the e-pawn, but it's actually just not the case. A better try would have been bishop c1, but even here, this doesn't really change the story because after bishop c2 check and bishop takes e4, my king, you can see now, is cut off along the second rank. Actually has no moves, and, I'm just too passive here. So I tried to go active with bishop knight d5, but after bishop takes d5 and e takes d5, black just played the move rook d2, and I think this is really, really good judgment because, some people might go rook takes g2 and try to, just corral the g-pawns very quickly, but you might give me a sliver of hope or counterplay with this d-pawn if it stays alive, and so by playing rook d2, you just ensured that you pick it up right away. And frankly, the double g-pawns aren't really mobile at all. And so there's just a very, very simple plan for black to bring the king up into the position and then eventually get me in zugzwang because I'm stuck defending my own weaknesses, and that'll just be the ball game. So after rook d2, I went bishop c1. And after rook takes d5, I at least get to free my king with king c2. And you might say, well, this bishop is controlling these squares. This pawn is controlling these ones. Maybe I can hold here. But black does a very, very good job of effectively locking my king in, which means that I can't actually support the pawns or generate counterplay against black's queenside pawns. And so after king c2, Yudasin played b5. And this move ensures that my king can never cross the d file or even come up on the c file. And so my king's basically, trapped, and it just spells trouble. After g3, king f7, bishop f4, king e6, g5, and king f5, you can see that I'm slowly running out of moves, and it's just a ball game. And again, if I just push either g-pawn, I'm in trouble. I hang the bishop or I just lose a pawn. And my king now is going to be stuck defending the a3 pawn, so I really can't do very much here. I played bishop d2, and then black went rook d8, which is a really good waiting move, which also entertains going with the rook to c8. I went bishop f4 back, and then king e4 is played. And that was the other idea with rook d8 is now it frees the king, because if I go g6, black can just go rook g8. And again here, not only is he picking up the g6 pawn, with the king on e4, he's also ensuring that my king can't get active and is boxed in. So very, very good technique by Yudasin to just limit my activity. I played the move king c3, because what else? And now black played rook d3 check. And I went king b2 to defend the a3 pawn. But now rook b3 check was played. And because my king would have to go to a2 to defend the a pawn, I actually just resigned here. The point being that after king a2, black just goes king f5. And frankly here, I have no moves. I'm basically in zugzwang because any move that I make does harm to my position. If I move the bishop along this diagonal, I hang... if I move the bishop along this diagonal, I hang the g5 pawn. If I move the bishop along this diagonal, I hang the g3 pawn. And if I push the g3 pawn, I hang the king on the bishop on f4. And note that if I do that, I can try to run my g-pawn, but the rook gets back in time before I queen. And if I, of course, push the other g-pawn, the black king just captures. So basically, I'm in a position where I have no moves that are productive, and essentially, once black gets one of the g-pawns, his rook will roam again, and then the king will just waltz in and establish opposition, and the black rook will come from behind and corral the g-pawn while also attacking my weak pawns. So it's really just simple technique from here, and that's why I threw in the towel. Now, I will say Yudasin's technique after the queen trade was very impressive, and I think it's very, very instructive to see just how my king was locked in the box and how, basically the rook was just all over the place, attacking my weak pawns, challenging my knight, which did not have a good outpost, and that just spelled my doom. But obviously, I was extremely disappointed in the outcome of this game because essentially I had a great opening position. I had the two bishops pretty much for nothing. I got very ambitious and decided to castle queenside, which wasn't entirely necessary, but also good. And then I basically lost control of the position, and I completely misevaluated the circumstances after the exchange sack. So, it was just a very, very strange game because normally I don't misevaluate positions. I might miscalculate. That's, typically what would happen in a loss. But to completely misjudge what the truth of a position is was an eye opener for me, because I thought I was better. I thought I was better after the exchange sack, and then I realized I was worse, and that was just a huge shock. So definitely need to be a little bit more concrete and less generic when evaluating positions. Anyways, with this loss, this also meant that I lost my second game in a row and now was on -3 through 6 rounds. So this tournament officially became a disaster, and there were 3 more rounds to try and do something about it. So I was just, and after round 6, it was really DEFCON 5 for me, or whichever the worst DEFCON is. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.